Hi everyone, I'm Jeongeun Kim, a recent graduate of Harvard Medical School. During my time at Harvard, I worked with Dr. Yuri Quintana in the Division of Clinical Informatics at Beth Deaconess Medical Center. Today, I'll be presenting my work on constructing a parsable clinical trial eligibility criteria representation using natural language processing. Clinical trials offer an opportunity for better treatments to current patients or future patients and advanced scientific research. And for these clinical trials to be successful, defining the target population, determining the eligibility criteria, and ensuring an optimal sample of enrollment with measurable outcomes are necessary. Clinical trial recruitment is based on eligibility criteria, most often displayed in unstructured free text format. Currently, there are no requirements in the format, structure, or content of the eligibility criteria. It can be as long as what you see on the right, or it can be as short as what you see on the right, without explicit headers, reading inclusion or exclusion criteria, or this exclusion criteria can simply be NA. Because of such heterogeneity in the information presented as the eligibility criteria, clinical trial recruitment is often manually done by clinical research staff, which is time consuming and costly to find such expertise. Unfortunately, enrolling a sufficient number of patients has been a long-standing problem. Additionally, the lack of standardization in the eligibility criteria prevents the automatic extraction of the eligibility criteria and the application of automatic identification of eligible patients. There has been efforts to create a formal representation of the eligibility criteria, but the tools currently available require manual interpretation of the syntactic rules and semantic concepts in the eligibility criteria, and many predate the current state-of-the-art machine learning and electronic health records. As a solution to such problems, NLP has been identified as a solution to analyze unstructured text and generate structured representation and be used for an accurate and robust cohort selection for a successful clinical trial. Even farther, the cohort selection can be improved by algorithms that match clinical trials eligibility criteria to data in the electronic health records. My study presents a parsable clinical trial eligibility criteria representation based on medical entity frequency and binary entity relationships. The data I used were found on clinicaltrials.gov. All clinical trials were searched under prosthetic neoplasms on August 17th, 2021, which yielded 483 trials. Each of the trials were downloaded as an XML file, which was processed to extract the eligibility criteria. The eligibility criteria of each trial was searched for the term inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria. Then it was separated into two text files, one for inclusion and the other for exclusion criteria. For the trials that did not explicitly mention inclusion or exclusion criteria, all the text under eligibility criteria were considered as inclusion criteria, which yielded an empty text file for the exclusion criteria. Then these 966 text files were processed using the Google Healthcare and Natural Language API. However, some of the text files failed to process due to resource exhaustion from a rate limit in the number of requests the API could take in a minute. The number of trials that were considered for the final analysis was 237, which had both the inclusion and exclusion criteria processed successfully. The NLP tool I use in the Google Healthcare Natural Language Processing API, this model is a pre-trained model to extract information from medical text and uses context-aware models to extract medical entities, relations, contextual attributes, certainty assessments, and temporal assessments. To be specific, it maps text into a predefined set of 28 semantic types of medical knowledge categories and identifies binary relationships between the entity mentions. The decision to use Google's product over other commercial products came from its simplicity to configure, ability to capture diverse semantic types, and its compatibility with Google Colab that I used to write my script and Google Drive that I used as backend storage. Now let's dive into the findings. These histograms show the medical entities identified by Google NLP. Out of 28 possible semantic types, there were 26 identified in the inclusion criteria and 25 identified in the exclusion criteria. All the entities identified in the exclusion criteria were found in the inclusion criteria. In both the inclusion and exclusion criteria, problem and procedure were identified as the two most common entities, followed by laboratory data, anatomical structure, and medicine in the inclusion criteria, and followed by medicine, anatomical structure, and severity in the exclusion criteria. A study in October 2020 that identified about 87,000 medical entities in 352,000 trials. The four most common entities were condition, measurement, drug, and procedure. These four entities can be considered equivalent to the entities of Google NLP, problem, body measurement, or lab data, medicine, and procedure, which were also found to be common among the prostatic neoplasm trials analyzed in this study. Here, the column on the left of each table shows the top 5 terms based on the frequency in the inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria. The term prior therapy treatment are shown the most common in the inclusion and exclusion criteria, while the inclusion criteria included the term PSA, which stands for prostate-specific antigen, and months, while the exclusion criteria included the term history and treatment. The column on the right shows the semantic type or functional type that I manually mapped to the terms. As expected, the most common semantic types that we saw in the previous slide, such as procedure and laboratory, appear the most common here. While the most common medical entity problem isn't shown in this term frequency table, it's likely that the temporal concepts are highly related to the entity problem. The temporal assessment identifies the temporality of the term as either current, clinical history, family history, upcoming, or allergy. It's likely that the term prior, previous months, and history are related to either the problem or procedure in a temporal sense, such as in the context of prior history of something or X number of months since diagnoses. This table shows the binary relationships identified in the exclusion criteria. The frequency of the binary relationship is the highest on the upper left corner right here and lowest in the bottom right corner right here. In both inclusion and exclusion criteria, there were 22 relationships identified with 21 in common. In the exclusion criteria, the relationship between substance abuse and severity was identified, while in the inclusion criteria, the relationship between medicine and metform was identified, while it wasn't in the exclusion criteria. Based on the entity frequency and the binary relationship, this is the formal representation I set forth. The data is stored in a JSON format where the keys are the entities mentioned in the column main entity from the table in the previous slide, and the values are all the related entities within one object. The inclusion and exclusion criteria should have similar structure, but can be consisted of different key values as the relationships identified in each criteria are slightly different. All binary relationships identified should be represented in the formal representation, where the entities listed in the column main entity from the previous table should be the keys of the JSON. The decision of using JSON came from its scalability and the ability to add multiple objects under one entity on a need basis, as some clinical trials may need to list, for example, multiple problems. If the eligibility criteria gets long, the fields and the schema can be easily updated here. Previous studies have pointed out the syntactical and semantic complexity of clinical trial eligibility criteria and the need for text simplification. The biggest advantage of this formal representation is that it captures the information needed in a clinical trial eligibility criteria in a standardized way and provide more consistency in the information we expect to see, thus making it machine readable and parsable. In other words, it is a systematic and more scalable criteria simplification without you losing information. The structure and the relationships and the names of the semantic types are more intuitive and easier to follow for medical experts or clinical trial project managers with less technical background when constructing the eligibility criteria. My representation explicitly calls for the separation of inclusion and exclusion criteria to increase scrutiny in the eligibility status and decrease ambiguity. Considering that Google Healthcare NLP is a pre-trained model, not necessarily trained with the clinical trial eligibility criteria, it was important to evaluate the performance of Google NLP. MD was asked to annotate 3 randomly chosen clinical trials that were included in this analysis based on the 28 semantic types that Google Healthcare NLP uses. The total number of terms identified by the medical expert was 129, while the Google NLP identified 89 terms. For consistency, the evaluation was based on only the terms and phrases identified by both methods. The results showed that the Google NLP and manual annotation showed a high agreement. This work is one of the earliest of its kind to use automated annotation to create a structural representation, and no work, to the best of my knowledge, has done an analysis separately on inclusion and exclusion criteria. With Google NLP being released on December 2020, Google NLP has not been used in clinical trial eligibility criteria analysis before the study, nor has it been evaluated extensively. The use of an existing commercial tool such as Google NLP can easily help distribute the work and be adapted by others. I plan on sharing my annotation of the 237 prosthetic neoplasm trials to contribute to more publicly available annotated data. Potential applications of the structural representation includes identification of patients in clinical settings, cohort selection, and automatic clinical trial recruitment, which will contribute to minimizing the cost of time, financials, and expertise. The biggest challenge of the study was that the extraction of inclusion and exclusion criteria from the eligibility criteria was based on the terms inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria in the text. Due to the unstructured nature of the eligibility criteria, if there were other synonyms indicating the beginning of the two criteria, the extraction would not have separated them properly. Another limitation of the study was that the study only looked at prosthetic neoplasm trials. Although the results from the study showed high relevance to the results of another study that analyzed a much larger number of trials across different disease conditions, additional work on the generalizability of the structural representation in other clinical trials is needed. The file that came back with an error and could not be included in this study's analysis was later analyzed as well, which makes the sample size twice as larger than this study. And the results were very similar. My future work will include a more rigorous evaluation of the performance and coverage of the Google NLP by comparing it with expert manual annotation. Also, more investigation on the compatibility of prosthetic neoplasm clinical trials and newly presented structural representation through reverse mapping will be necessary. I hope to support ontologies in the representation to increase the interoperability between clinical trial data and EHR data. And the ability to support parent-child relationship will be ideal to capture more detailed information. The ultimate goal is to create an automated clinical trial matching algorithm based on this representation. These are all the references that I found really useful when writing my paper. And thank you so much for listening. And please feel free to reach out to me at janekim319@gmail.com.